to our webinar. We'll get started here in just a minute. I'd like to let you know that we've begun recording the session, so we can record the chat feature and Jennifer's presentation. It will all be posted on the ICPN website shortly after our webinar. If you haven't done so already, could you please log in with your name, your affiliation, and how many people are joining you in your room today? That helps us for tracking purposes at the conclusion of our grant that's generously funded our programming today. It is 11 o'clock, so we'll get started. Thanks again for being here. My name is Bronwyn Eves, and I'm the project manager for the Illinois Collections Preservation Network. Thank you for being part of this webinar today, and thank you to the Illinois State Library for hosting our webinar series. Especially like to thank Debbie Aggert at the State Library. I would also like to mention that the ICPN and all of our programming would not be possible without the generous support of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. They are sponsoring our ICPN programming through a Connecting to Collections grant. Before we get started into our preservation topic, I'll just share with you a short history of the Illinois Collections Preservation Network, or ICPN. In 2009, a group of preservation professionals from several libraries, museums, historical societies, and other related professional groups received an IMLS Connecting to Collections Planning Grant. During the one-year time period, the groups talked to museum professionals and library professionals across the state to find out what are the preservation needs and wants across our state. A survey of around 300 institutions revealed that there's a great demand for preservation training, support among Illinois preservation professionals. This survey information was used to write a statewide preservation plan, form the ICPN, and apply for an IMLS Connecting to Collections implementation grant. In 2011, Illinois was one of only 6 states to receive that prestigious implementation grant, and today's webinar is the results of that grant. You can find much more information on our website, including a list of grant partners and additional programming. Some of our other highlights of the ICPN programming include free in-person disaster response workshops in which we are presenting topic of disaster preparedness, disaster response, and disaster salvage. At the end of each workshop, we have a mini water disaster in which participants salvage wet materials and learn more about how to handle those materials in disaster. We have one workshop remaining on July 9th in Freeport, Illinois. If you'd like to join us at that free workshop, please contact me for more information. We also have compiled a variety of applying for a grant
Great, thanks, Bronwyn. Hopefully we've got the audio all set up all right, so you all should be able to hear me. Today I'm going to be covering the second part of our photographic webinar series. The first part was the identification of basic photographic print processes, and today's we'll be going over some basic preservation of photographic and still image materials. So we'll be covering prints, a little bit on negatives, sort of tangentially on transparencies, and then covering just basic exhibit and care for all photographic materials. So as Bronwyn said, if you haven't had a chance or you're just logging in, do tell us what university or other institution you are representing and how many people are attending this webinar at your institution. That would be very helpful to us. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to start with was, and I apologize for those of you who are at the first one. Actually, that would be a good question to start with, is could I have a very quick show of hands? If you all go up to the very top of your screen, there's a little dude going like this that's hand raising. If we could go through and just do a quick show of hands of people raising their hands who were in attendance at the first webinar last week, just so I have an idea of how much of this content I need to repeat. About half of you, it looks like. Check marks work too. Wow, okay, the majority of you certainly, but not all. Okay, great. Then I won't spend too much time belaboring. Thank you. You can clear your hands now if you want. But I won't spend too much time belaboring the resources then, but did want, for those of you who weren't in attendance with the first part, to go over them briefly. Two great book resources that are really helpful if you're managing photographic collections, either for preservation or identification, are Jim Riley's Care and Identification of 19th Century Prints and Mary Lynn Ritzenthaler and Diane Voigt O'Connor's Photographs, Archival Care and Management. These two publications are both fairly recently available. Neither are terrifically expensive, but are freely available through interlibrary loan, even through public libraries. If you don't have them at your institution and they're a bit above your availability price-wise, I recommend that you check them out over interlibrary loan and see if they'd be useful to you. I find both of these resources really, really useful. The third, which I won't spend a lot of time on because I spent quite a bit of time on this last week, is Graphics Atlas. But I did want to touch on this because we were using Graphics Atlas last week as a useful tool for identification of prints, but it also does have preservation and care information in there, and so I wanted to be sure to show people the relevant information that's available on Graphics Atlas really quickly as well. So I wanted to switch programs, which I need to remember how to do. Sorry, we have just gone beyond my meager technical abilities, so I'm going to do this, which is maybe not what I wanted to do. And here, yes, wake up. Okay, so you should now all see the web, and this is the Graphics Atlas tool. This is just the home page for it. But what I wanted to do is to walk you through some of the preservation information that is on here as well, and just make sure that you're all aware of this. This is at graphicsatlas.org. And if you go to, oops, not that way, sorry, to the identification module, you can pick any type of photographic format you want. I will just pick silver gelatin prints because they're a really easy and common photographic format. So you'll see all the different ways they were toned. This is more relevant to what we were talking about last week, but you'll also see a section here on deterioration with some really great images that you can enlarge, showing different stability problems with images, including fading and modeling, loss of highlight detail. You can see some great examples of mirroring that I'll be showing you a little bit later today. You can see some different, this is actually more of a ID thing with the layer structure, but also some highlights of the different layers there. Talks about prevalence, and then about some blemishes that we'll be talking about in just in a second with the RC coding. So this is, obviously all of these examples are particularly relevant to silver gelatin prints, but this sort of information is available on all of them. So I wanted to make sure that you all were familiar with that. And get back to this, and it's going to probably start me. Nope, wonderful. Okay. So anyway, so those resources are great, and be sure to look at them. I need to remember which arrow to push here. Okay, so starting on deterioration. So the first, I'm kind of going roughly in chronological order with the ages of the photographs here. So one of the earliest photographic formats that we talked about last week was cased photographs, tintypes, daguerreotypes, and ambrotypes. All commonly were in those union cases that we talked about last week, which are the little presentation cases. All of those cases actually have their own preservation issues. And so we talked a little bit last week about the fragility themselves of the daguerreotypes and the ambrotypes and tintypes, and the fact that daguerreotypes have an amazingly delicate surface. And should always be at least enclosed behind glass, ideally in one of these union cases or other prepared case specifically for daguerreotype storage. Ambrotypes, because they are an image on glass, have all the fragility that is things are generally presented in also have their own issues. And so you can see here in the image on the left all of the elements that go into making one of these union cases, and a ruler, which is just an addition so you get scale here. So you get a sense of just how many different types of material are involved in these cases. This particular case is a leather covered wooden case, which is actually very, very common. Some of the later ones can actually be made out of gutta percha, but most frequently they are the leather covered or cloth covered wood. And so you can see here, let me pull up my trusty arrow, and you can see here, here's the leather, here's the wood that forms the actual case. There are all sorts of backing layers and layers and layers and layers. Here is an actual daguerreotype, looking pretty sad, pathetic in there. Here is the 2 layers of the brass preserver. Now, anybody who knows anything about objects preservation knows that brass is actually a very unstable metal. And so the fact that this preserver actually has a very thin brass layer on it is actually a problem, because brass itself is unstable. And so you're sandwiching this unstable metal into a sealed package with, in some cases with daguerreotypes, a fairly unstable photographic image. And so you need to be very cautious, particularly when these things are stored in high humidity, of oxidation of the materials and any sort of corrosion products forming, particularly with that brass. The wood itself also off-gasses, so you get the sealed container again with some really unstable materials being melded into it. All of that said, a stable union case is far better than taking it out of its union case. So despite the fact that union cases are unstable and probably not absolutely ideal for long-term photographic storage, they are A, authentic to the piece, so you want to go ahead and save them, and B, they are serving a very, very good purpose. And so I would never disassemble a union case. But if one is falling apart, you may want to consider, if you have a photographic conservator available to you, whether or not the object can be rehoused safely. Another issue that you will have with union cases is weeping cover glass. This doesn't happen all the time, but it's particularly prevalent with older glass, which a lot of these union cases have. If you notice little tiny fissures or little tiny droplets forming on the cover glass of one of your cased photographs, you want to watch that very carefully, because your glass is starting to deteriorate. A small amount of fogging or weeping isn't particularly concerning, but if it begins to get severe, it actually can start to damage the photographic image itself. And so if your cover glass starts to weep quite badly, that's something you'd want to see about getting replaced. And again, I really would talk to, if you could, a photographic conservator about that and not try to do it yourself, because it's very likely you could damage the photograph or destroy the union case in the process. So you really want to talk to someone who knows how these things are built and how to replace it. But these are things that you do need to watch for. And I will say, if you all have questions along the way, the first time I did this, technology, it just swaps off who gets the technological glitch. Technology is working just fine for me this time, so I am able to fully read chat while I'm doing the presentation. So if you have any questions about anything, feel free to go ahead and chat away. And I'm pretty good at watching chat while I talk, so if you've got a question, feel free to go ahead and let me know. Paper negatives and salted paper prints. We talked briefly about salted paper prints last week and just touched on the fact that they were produced from paper negatives. Paper negatives, by their very nature, because they have to be able to transmit light to be able to act as a negative, are on very, very thin paper, almost tissue weight paper. and it is a wet process to actually produce an image through the paper negative. And so these very thin papers that got wet repeatedly typically didn't stand up very long. So the number that we have in existence now is actually exceedingly limited. However, those that are around now probably are protected, and physically, although they're very delicate, are probably reasonably stable. However, both of these formats are exceedingly light sensitive. They are both produced with the same chemistry. One is just a positive and one is a negative process. And so you want to be sure to protect both of these formats from direct or even indirect light. Very strongly guard against exhibiting either of these, since these are extremely light sensitive. You can actually see fading of the image on these materials directly after exposure to light. So I'm going to get rid of my arrow here so it's not distracting. And so even just possibly having patrons view these, if these are in your collections, these are reasonably rare older photographs, but if you have some, you really want to take some precautions and not have them brought out all the time, conceivably, because even just bringing them out for people to view can actually bring about image deterioration with these. So you want to be really aware of that, really cautious about the amount of light that these are exposed to, particularly UV light, but even just visible office lighting, if it's protected from UV radiation, you still want to try to reduce the amount of even visible light exposure that these are going to get. Quick anecdote, and I don't want to derail this webinar with too many anecdotes, because I did that last time and ran out of time before we had time for questions. But quick anecdote with these is I used to actually work at the Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin, which has one of the premier photographic collections, certainly in North America, possibly in the world. They have the world's first photograph, and they have a very big collection of Talbot photographs, who is the person who came up with the salted paper print and used the paper negative process. And the salted paper prints are sometimes actually called Talbot types for James Henry Fox Talbot. Nonetheless, we also had an album of salted paper prints of erotica, pornography, whatever you want to call it. That was actually owned by a prince. I can't tell you which one, not because I'm being coy, but because I honestly and truly just can't remember which one it was. But it was a British prince. And he had collected this and put it into an album, and it was his personal possession. And this was of great interest to people for potentially dubious reasons, but nonetheless got constant calls at the Harry Ransom Center for people wanting to view it. And so we actually, for that one, because of the risk to the images, because many of them were salted paper prints, and because many of them had faded to the point that you could barely read the images anymore, actually had a curatorial consent that they had to go through for that one. And it wasn't just curator. After a while, that one actually went beyond just curatorial consent, but actually had director of the Harry Ransom Center had to approve your reasons for wanting to view that. And it wasn't because we were being prudish. We had lots of artsy photographs, but the reason was because the risk to the photograph was so high, and that one had so many people coming in that didn't have true research value, that we felt it was necessary to go ahead and protect those images from fading to the point that they wouldn't be recognizable anymore. So, enough digression. Cyanotypes and platinum prints. From last week, perhaps you all will remember that platinum prints are actually remarkably stable. Very light stable, very acid stable, all kinds of stuff. They're one of the most stable photographic formats there is. However, materials next to them can actually be damaged quite significantly simply by the nature of being stored next to them. And so this is a nice illustration of that burning that I was talking about last week, where we have a platinum photograph, again, kind of a high-end portraiture there in a palladium print, and then just a letter that was kept next to it for some period of time, given the darkness of that burn, probably many years. But the platinum metal that forms the image on the photograph actually causes an acid burn in adjacent materials. So if you do identify a platinum print, first of all, if you see this, you know you have a platinum print or something that has been toned with platinum. The darker the burn, the more likely it is that you have a platinum print, and not just platinum toning, because the concentration of platinum is going to be quite a bit higher. But if you see a burn like this, obviously you're going to want to protect that adjacent material to make sure that you're not getting any more of that image transfer. And so making sure that you interleave preferably with something absorbent, but you can actually just interleave with polyester too. That'll work. I always defaulted to interleaving with paper as opposed to polyester whenever possible. So for platinum prints, I prefer paper just to be able to absorb that acid that's being wicked out of the photograph and then to periodically exchange that. The platinum print will not benefit or be hindered by the paper or polyester. It's simply just absorbing free acids, which generally just make me nervous. With cyanotypes, however, there is a very, very good cause for polyester with cyanotypes. And there was actually, Nicolette, I would say it really doesn't matter. I would go with more cost effective. If the paper that it's mounted on appears to be acidic and brittle, you would probably benefit from buffered because it's going to help to stabilize the mounting board that the platinum print is on. However, if you've just got either just a platinum print with no mounting board, or if the mounting board appears to be very, very stable, then the cheaper is probably going to be unbuffered. The platinum print itself isn't going to really care. So it's really what's benefiting the overall environment. But since you know you're sacrificing that paper and you're going to be discarding it periodically, I would go with the cheaper of the two if you're not going to have any direct benefit from choosing one over the other. There was research really recently presented at the American Institute for Conservation on the storage of cyanotypes. And this was done by the Image Permanence Institute, who are the folks who did Graphics Atlas and the ones who have just recently republished the Jim Riley Guide to Historic Photographic Processes, and who are, the gods of photographic preservation. But Doug Nishimura at IPI just did a presentation at the AIC conference talking about the storage of cyanotypes. And the common practice has always been for storing cyanotypes that you never want to store them in buffered material. And we'll be talking about general storage in just a little bit, and that by and large, my recommendation is buffered or very, very high quality unbuffered paper. Generally, cyanotypes were one of the ones that we argued for the high quality unbuffered paper because an alkaline environment, so what is provided by having buffered storage materials, is an alkaline environment. That alkaline environment can actually fade or even eventually have a color shift effect on cyanotypes, because the image material in the cyanotype, the Prussian blue pigment that's formed in the cyanotype process, is actually pH sensitive. And so it's kind of like a litmus paper almost, in that it can fade or possibly shift into the more lilac-y, theoretically in an extreme almost pinkish hues, although I've never actually seen that in practice. So we were always very careful to store our cyanotypes in a pH neutral environment. Well, the IPI just presented and said that even pH neutral environments, because the pH is still going to be higher than the pH of the cyanotype, where thinking about the pH range here, acidic are the low numbers, alkaline are the high numbers, pH neutral being 7. If you take an acidic cyanotype, which has a pH of below 7, usually they're happily sitting at somewhere like 4.5 or 5 pH, give or take. Put it into a pH 7 folder, which is what you would buy for a pH neutral storage enclosure. That pH is still higher than the cyanotype. It is still going to wick some of those acidic ions away from the cyanotype and still can cause image fading. So what the IPI is recommending is that you always interleave or sleeve with polyester when you're working with cyanotypes or blueprints. If you really are concerned about the image density, that is the only safe way to store them, other than, matted and framed. But basically, you don't want them in contact with anything that could be wicking away the acids that are actually in the cyanotype itself. So just word to the wise, polyester is a cyanotype's best friend. Oh, I will say, actually, was one more thing about cyanotypes, is that I have only heard this anecdotally, but I've heard it from very trustworthy resources, that if you do have some fading of cyanotypes due to storage or also due to light sensitivity, because cyanotypes are, while not as light sensitive as a salted paper print, they are in the moderately light sensitive area, perhaps even severe but not extreme light sensitive. They're not an image that you want to put onto long-term exhibit by any means. If you do see fading in a cyanotype, particularly due to light, but also sometimes due to the alkalinity, putting them into a happier environment. So if it's an alkalinity shift, it's putting them back into a more acidic environment, perhaps interleaving them with a bunch of other cyanotypes. Or if they've been exposed to light, going ahead and putting them into dark storage. There is anecdotal evidence that the image will at least partially regenerate back when you put it back into its ideal storage conditions. So I said, I haven't seen that in reality, but I've heard from several people that it does happen. I still wouldn't use that as an excuse to put them onto exhibit for a long term and say, oh, it's okay, it's a cyanotype. If we lose a little bit of the image due to light damage, it'll just regenerate. It's like cutting off a gecko's tail. No, it's don't count on that. But I have heard that, so it's something to know in the back of your head, but certainly don't use that as a selection tool. Albumin prints, which are one of the first really common photographic format, unfortunately have a whole myriad of issues with them. Part of this is that the silver chemistry wasn't really fully maximized at this point. So the amount of silver that you have in these images is not nearly as dense as you get with much later photographic processes. And so the likelihood of fading here is a little bit higher because you just have less silver forming the image. Also, the albumin itself, so the emulsion layer that holds the silver, as we discussed last week, has a lot of reaction with changes in relative humidity. And so we discussed the fact that you always see these mounted because they'll curl up into little tiny tubes if these aren't mounted to card because the albumin contracts so badly due to changes in relative humidity. Well, even if these are mounted absolutely flat, that albumin is still absorbing and contracting and releasing relative humidity as there are changes in the environment. So particularly with ones that have not had ideal storage over time, you're going to start to see a very fine crackling or a craquelure of the image surface, and that's of the albumin finally stressing to the point of fracturing because of these changes in relative humidity. And so this is the best image I can find. The best thing to do is to find an albumin print that has obviously had a bit of a rough life and look at it under a loupe, ideally under raking light, so light that's coming in at a very low angle. You should be able to see this really fine crackling pattern. Let me grab my arrow here, but you see there are little hairline fractures here. These are not all on the leaf. A lot of these are little crackles on the image themselves. Don't confuse these though with the paper fibers. You can also see paper fibers in an albumin print. So what you're seeing is a complex pattern of different linear patterns. I hate to repeat the word pattern, but different linear manifestations on the image. So you've got the paper fibers which are linear. You may have an image that might have some lines in there, but then you've also got this fine craquelure in the emulsion layer, in the albumin layer itself. And this is something that you want to watch for. It just shows that the emulsion has gotten really stressed out. There's no way to reverse it, but you want to try to obviously avoid it. In extreme cases, you could actually start to get a little bit of flaking, although that's only in the most extreme cases. We've already talked about curling and the fact that these materials, if unmounted, will curl up into little bitty tubes. So hopefully you won't find any of those. But if you do, they really need to be humidified and need to be held down because they will just roll right back up. Even if you've got them in a good environment, they're going to want to roll back up. So at the very least, having them in a good polyester sleeve that's going to hold them nice and flat. But the likelihood of finding one of these unmounted is pretty slim, but that curling is a risk. Or if they're coming delaminated from their mounting board, they're going to start to curl on you. Image fading usually is due to light damage. That's the most common reason for light damage in albumin, or for fading in albumin prints. But they also are slightly pH sensitive in the same way that cyanotypes are pH sensitive, but not nearly as so. There has been some research that has shown that in a highly alkaline environment, so stored in an alkaline buffered folder or in an alkaline sleeve or something like that, in a very high humidity environment, that pH transfer can start to actually cause the chemistry with the silver particles to change slightly and cause image fading. It is only when you're storing things in the proper type of in an alkaline storage environment with unregulated and very high relative humidity, this is a risk. But it is something you want to consider if you have a lot of important albumin photographs and you've got them in a very poorly regulated environment. You might want to consider whether or not you want to do alkaline storage or not. But that's just something to weigh. Obviously, if you can get them into better storage, that would be the best thing because the alkaline buffered envelopes or sleeves or folders actually really do benefit the photographs. It's the humidity that's really damaging them. One of the most common forms of photographic deterioration that most of us have seen is silver mirroring, and this is common with silver gelatin prints. It can be observed with some albumin prints, but usually, again, the content of the silver in an albumin print is so small that you don't frequently see a lot of mirroring in those. You start to see a higher concentration of silver particles in the silver gelatin prints, both the printing out and the developing out prints, and so it's much more common for you to see mirroring in these images. Mirroring, basically, what it is that the colloidal silver that forms the image material of the photograph begins to deteriorate, usually with either exposure to, again, high relative humidity or UV light, one of the two, or a combination of both. With that exposure, the colloidal silver molecules begin to break down, and one of the byproducts of that breakdown is elemental silver ions. So not even elemental, so just silver ions, so just Ag+, for those of you who know chemistry. And so those little silver ions then are very mobile because they're tiny chemically. And they're going to migrate through the gelatin, or if an albumin print, the albumin layer, and slowly begin to float up towards the surface, just because they are borderline gaseous, but not quite, but they're very, very mobile. When they get to the very top of the emulsion, that's really all the further they can go, because again, they are not gaseous, they are just small, migrate up to the top, and then they just sit there because they can't go any further. Well, sooner or later, some buddies come up as well, and so you've got all of these little silver ions floating up to the surface, and when the silver ions get close enough to each other, they begin to bond and form silver molecules. And so those silver molecules form elemental pure silver. And so what you're basically seeing with this silver mirroring is the formation of a very, very fine, sometimes only 1 or 2 molecule deep silver plate on the front of your photograph. The beauty of this, I think it's actually kind of cool. I mean, it's distracting. It is not in any way deteriorating the quality of your image. It's deteriorating your translation of the image. The beauty of it is that these molecules actually migrate pretty much straight up. Their mobility is pretty limited, and they don't tend to go side to side very much. So it's not decreasing the sharpness or the contrast of your image. You are not losing the silver. You're simply changing the silver from a black particle to a shiny silver particle. And so your translation, your ability to understand the photograph changes a little bit, and it really depends on what angle you hold it at. But it can be very distracting when you're looking to exhibit something. Photographic conservators can reduce this to reduce the amount of visual distraction. The problem is then, to reduce it, you are actually then removing image material. And so you really want to balance what is the purpose of this photographic image, and will it benefit from having that mirroring removed? Because you are actually then decreasing the amount of image material in the photograph, and therefore purposefully fading the photograph. If the photograph's true purpose is aesthetic appeal, and it's something that you're going to be exhibiting all the time, which if it's mirroring, I would question, because light damage is one of the things that causes this. So, okay, I'm glad I'm not frozen anymore. If it is a material that the visual understanding of this piece is really, really important, you may want to consider having it removed professionally. But there is no easy, everyman's way of reducing silver mirroring. Generally, those of us in libraries and archives, this is just a manifestation of the photograph. It's kind of like, age spots or wrinkles or whatever. It just means the photograph is old. It's not been in the greatest environment necessarily, or perhaps it wasn't processed completely. Take care of it so it doesn't get any worse, but generally, we tend to just live with it. Another common deterioration for some silver gelatin prints. This is only for resin-coated prints. And last week we talked about the different papers that some modern photographs are printed in. All historic photographs have been just on fiber-based paper, which is just paper. It's just a fancy word for paper. However, when we got to modern photographic processing and using a lot of machines to process photographs, the paper actually began to be resin coated, and that resin coating made the paper much more stable in the processing liquids as we looked at developing out technologies where the images were actually formed in chemical baths. But it also made it much easier for the machines to manipulate the photographs if they had this really plasticky, more rigid coating. Well, with this addition came some issues. And so one of the most common ones that we see, and probably a lot of you have seen this at some point, is with RC papers and silver gelatin developing out prints, you get redox blemishes. And so these little, let me get my There we go. Little tiny orange spots. For those of you who are more involved in preservation and have dealt with microfilm manufacture or microfilm care, redox blemishes are unfortunately really, really common in poorly processed microfilm. Less common in photographic prints, but still there. And it has something to do with the amount of plastic in the paper, because of course microfilm is 100% polyester plastic. And we see redox blemishes quite frequently on microfilm. Maybe a little bit less commonly on RC coated paper, and then when you remove the resin coating, you see it not at all. So it has something to do with the plastic content of the paper and the breakdown. But basically this is just, again, a breakdown of the colloidal silver, and in this instance it actually shows as little orange dots. This is something that in microfilm you can actually fix by something called polysulfite treatment or brown toning, which completely changes the tone of the microfilm to true black and clear to kind of a chocolatey brown, orangey brown and clear, which, because microfilm is read by transmitting light, really doesn't change the way you interact with the microfilm at all. Would totally change the way you would interact with a black and white photograph. So typically we don't recommend polysulfiting for photographs, just for polyester film. But the breakdown, that redox blemishes, which is short for reduction and oxidation, which is just the chemical pathway for the deterioration, nonetheless they're there. So again, just something sadly that you probably have to live with, but denotes improper storage over time. Many of the color processes, almost all of the ones that we see typically, are dye-based processes. Dyes are unfortunately very, very prone to fading. The most common reason that we see dye fading is due to exposure to UV light, but elevated temperatures can also bring about dye deterioration and dye fading. By far the most common place you're going to see this is going to be in chromogenic color prints, so standard color, modern-ish color photographs are going to fade. And so most frequently what you're going to see, like this image here on the left, is the fading of the cyans, which is actually a little, I've never actually done research into this. I'd love to talk to a photoconservator about why this happens. But as far as fugitive dyes go, usually it's the red that's the most unstable. I don't know how many of you have remember those bumper stickers? Back around 9/11, there were bumper stickers really commonly that had a little print of the American flag, and it said, "These colors don't run." And then the red completely faded out of the bumper stickers. So no, they don't run, but they sure do fade, because you were left with just blue and white. That's a really common light sensitivity, that the red fades with exposure to light. With dye-based photographs, however, even though they are light sensitive, and this is typically due to light sensitivity, typically it is the cyans that tend to fade. And I'm just not sure what it is about the photographic process and why the cyans are less stable than the magentas. But in this case, that is true. And a lot of older chromogenic prints, my own included, from like early family portraits of, me at age 10, have faded to these lovely shades of kind of like purplish, or, this is not me, thank God, but, fantastic prom pictures that have faded to just kind of an orangey, what is that, tangerine color. That's just dye fading. So this happens most commonly with chromogenic prints, instamatic prints too, which are inherently unstable because of the amount of chemicals that are still involved in that photographic package there from the Polaroid process, are really unstable. Some slides will fade really, really quickly. If you've got the chrome-based slides, so Kodachrome, Ektachrome slides, actually are remarkably stable. Even though they are dye-based, the chemistry that holds the colors in place with those particular transparencies is pretty stable. But if you're not looking at a chrome-based slide, then those transparencies probably have the same image dye susceptibility that the chromogenic prints do. A lot of modern inkjet prints and some of the more modern digital prints that we talked about last week, inkjet being the one most people are familiar with, but some of the other processes that are more commercially available are also all dye-based. There are pigment-based printing processes out there, but you pay a pretty penny for them and you have to expressly select them. But if you do have images that you are afraid that you want to put on exhibit for a long time that are color-based, you really want to invest in some pigment-based inks to guarantee that your colors aren't going to shift, that your dyes aren't going to fade like this. Glass negatives, we didn't really talk about negatives much last week, but wanted to at least touch on them because there are some significant challenges to the preservation and storage of glass negatives. They're on glass, so I think it's probably pretty self-evident that obviously glass has its own issues, and a lot of glass negatives will break. One of the main reasons for this is improper storage, because glass negatives, for any of you who have handled an entire box of glass negatives, they are very heavy. And if you don't store them up on end, which is the appropriate way to store them, so I've got a little, this is not glass negatives, this is actually my business card box, but if you imagine each of these cards are little glass negatives, you want to store them in a box where they're all sitting up right on edge. Ideally, they make these little 4-flap folders that you can store them in to keep them from abrading and knocking against each other and possibly chipping off glass. Fairly expensive, but if the glass negatives are historically important, a very valuable, worthwhile cost for their storage. If you store them upright, though, so if you store them just stacked on top of each other, the weight on the very bottom piece is pretty extreme and can cause this fracturing. It's not just dropping them or jarring them that causes that fracture, but weight over time can also cause it. So just one more reason that you want to make sure that you store these properly over time. Additionally, glass plate negatives are exceedingly sensitive to storage temperature and relative humidity. And we'll be talking about these as we talk about storage environment as kind of one of the outliers of the standard for photographic storage. But these do not like to be really cold, and they do not like to be really dry, which a lot of photographs, that's kind of what we recommend for long-term storage. Not so with glass plate negatives. The reason behind that is that the gelatin emulsion that is on these is very thin and on the glass. Well, the glass is, of course, slick and shiny, as glass wants to be, and the gelatin doesn't have a really good hold on that glass. When you look at changes in temperature and relative humidity beyond sort of ambient room temperature, the glass begins to contract at a different rate than the gelatin does. And so when you see that difference in contraction and expansion, you'll start to see lifting. And that's what you're seeing here is a pretty extreme case, although I have a whole box of ones that look like this. This is pretty spectacular in a really sad kind of way. The emulsion actually literally like just peeling off of the glass. Really dry humidities can do this as well, because the adhesion between the two reduces the less humidity there is in the emulsion. So you want to beware of really dry environments and really cold environments with glass plate negatives. Cellulose diacetate plastic bases. I'm not even going to go into nitrate. I think most people know the woes of nitrate and its explosiveness, and the fact that generally, unless it's really, really artifactually valuable, you just want to get rid of nitrate if you can, reformat it if at all possible. Cellulose diacetate is a remarkably unstable plastic as well. But most people, it doesn't have the hazard, the hazmat type of issue that nitrate does. So many of us do try to keep cellulose diacetate in our collections. The problem is that its deterioration is actually much more rapid than cellulose nitrate, and in some ways much more disfiguring until it catches on fire, which is what the nitrate does. Cellulose diacetate typically forms characteristic deterioration in one of two ways. The far more common of the two is channeling, and that's what we're seeing here on the image on the left. And that is all of these little peaks and valleys being formed is, again, very similar to the glass. Change in the expansion and contraction of the cellulose diacetate plastic base, which is different than the expansion and contraction of the gelatin emulsion layer. In this case, what it is the deterioration of the plastic and the plastic emulsion starting to shrink, while the emulsion does not shrink correspondingly. And what that causes is the emulsion to actually cockle and buckle up into these little peaks. This can be fixed if it is an exceedingly important photograph, because it is not cheap. It's several $100s an image, but Chicago albumin works. And I'm going to type that in if anybody's interested here. One thing I cannot do is type and talk at the same time. Sorry. Ironically, see, Chicago. It's normal Chicago. But the Chicago albumin works, ironically, not in Chicago. I think they're in Minnesota. They could be in New York. I honestly can't remember. But what they can do is actually put these into a chemical bath that releases the gelatin emulsion from the deteriorated cellulose diacetate base, relax the emulsion so that it flattens back out to its original planar dimension, and then mount it to an archival polyester base. So if you do have one of these images that's severely channeled and you really need that image, this is a treatment that you can have done. Like I said, it's really not cheap, but it's something to consider. Another less common, but still common enough to worth mentioning, deterioration of cellulose diacetate are these little blue pustules here, which are dyes that were in the plastic and the emulsion layer that come up as the acids are produced as the plastic deteriorates. Not nearly as common. Typically they're blue or magenta. Hello. There we go. Okay, so talked about storage. Wanted to touch briefly on these. And again, it's 11:44 and I talk too much. So by and large, already mentioned this, the cooler, the better. Generally, most photographs are happy between 30 and 40% relative humidity, which is a little bit drier than most of us tend to keep our storage if we have good control over our storage. If we don't have good control, we usually, unfortunately, get very dry in the winter and pretty moist in the summer, and 30 to 40 is somewhere in between. The best is to try to keep your fluctuations to an absolute minimum, and then if you can, get it down to 30 to 40%. Less fluctuations is actually better than, thank you, Dan. Less fluctuation is better than getting into 30 or 40. So stable is more important than drier if you need to make a choice. If you have a good environment, the ideal is stable and between 30 and 40%. Again, glass plates prefer closer to kind of room quality. So 40 to 50% is kind of human comfort zone. And the glass plate negatives tend to prefer that. Color images and any of the unstable plastics, so cellulose nitrate and cellulose diacetate, really are better stored frozen because of the dye instability and the plastic instability of those two. So if you do have cold storage as an option, that will slow down the inherent instability of those two processes. So the colder you can get those, the better. Most other images will benefit from cool storage, so 50 to 60 degrees, which is a little bit cooler than room temperature. So if you've got just, generally kind of, cool vault storage, generally photographs are going to be better preserved in a cooler environment, but only a few select materials actually prefer to be frozen. Again, glass plates really prefer to be warmer, closer to typical human comfort. Light, ideally dark storage is best, but the good news is most people store their photographs in boxes. So inherently, whatever kind of light you have going on in your storage environment, doesn't matter if all your photographs are in a box. So the easiest way to get dark storage is just to keep your materials in a box. For those that are really light sensitive, I'll be showing you a guide to that in just a minute. To sleeve or not to sleeve, this is one of the biggest questions that I typically get when I talk about photographic preservation and storage. There is no right answer. The answer to whether you want to sleeve your collection really needs to be based on evaluating many different factors. The first one is how often are your materials used? Now, first of all, consider that there are two different types of sleeves out there. There are paper sleeves and there are polyester sleeves. And please, 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 if you can, purchase polyester sleeves over polyethylene or polypropylene. Both polyethylene and polypropylene are okay plastics, but if you have a choice, polyester is by far the most stable plastic and the most appropriate for photographic storage. Polyethylene and polypropylene are both okay. If you do not know what kind of plastic your storage sleeve is, don't use it. You want to ensure that it is at the very least polyethylene or polypropylene, because a bad plastic can actually be exceedingly damaging to the photographic image. So you want to make sure that you're using a good quality plastic. Polyethylene, polypropylene, polyester, with polyester being the best. You also have the option of paper or folders or whatever. If you're sleeving them, you probably got either some sort of opaque paper sleeve, not glassine, please. Glassine is old school, not good quality paper. Or you've got a polyester or polypropylene sleeve. If the materials are used a whole lot, then protecting the emulsion from sticky little fingers from your staff or patrons is probably a good thing. And if they're used a whole lot, having them in plastic sleeves where the image is going to be visible for people to thumb through them is going to be a good step. The type of photograph. Some emulsions are more fragile than others. The degree of damage may actually belie ones that need to be protected. If the backing board is really brittle, then sleeving it may actually have a benefit. Sleeves, however, take up a lot of space. So yes, it would be lovely to sleeve your entire collection, But let's face it, it is going to increase the size of your collection half again, at least, not to mention add a lot of weight, especially if you're looking at polyester. Polyester is quite heavy and expensive. So if you don't have a ton of extra space, which none of us have, and you don't have a ton of extra money laying around, which none of us have, then you may want to be much more selective about which materials you choose to sleeve and not just think that you need to sleeve your entire collection. They are perfectly happy and stable sitting in their storage boxes by themselves if they're not being handled all the time without sleeves. You also want to evaluate the degree of risk. So again, if you've got really unregulated relative humidity, if you're storing these for some reason emulsion to emulsion, you can actually get the gelatin or the albumin to begin to stick to each other. Sleeving or interleaving there might be something that you want to consider. Likewise, abrasion, if these are in boxes that you're constantly pulling off a shelf and they're shifting around all the time, there is a risk of abrasion in the box there, and so sleeving or interleaving might be something you want to consider there as well. But they're all different factors to consider. There is no right answer for whether you want to sleeve or not sleeve. So enclosures, sleeves, obviously, as we just discussed. Archival folders also are great. You can store them in like flip-top document boxes. You can store them in flat storage. If they're very large photographs, I would say larger than 5x7, you're probably going to want to consider flat storage. If they're smaller snapshots, I said 5x7 is kind of the crossover. Once you get to 8x10, they're going to be bigger or almost as big as one of these boxes. You could probably go with an 8x10 in a document box because they hold 8.5x11 sheets of paper. But the larger photographs you're going to want to store flat. If you are storing them upright in a document box like this, you want to make sure that they're well supported and absolutely flat because you don't want these to slump and curl in storage. So they do make little archival spacers like this guy here, just made out of fluted board. You can actually purchase these wherever you purchase archival storage boxes. And that's going to ensure that your folders are nice and upright and not slumping. So just make sure you take care of that. Gloves or not gloves? The second most common question after sleeves. When you're handling photographic collections, in general, it's always recommended that you wear gloves. Please, if you are going to wear gloves, wear white cotton clean gloves. None of those little sticky dots, no nitrile, no latex, nothing. Just clean white cotton gloves. Wash the gloves regularly. Don't bleach them. Don't add fabric softener. Just a nice gentle detergent and hot water is all you need. You want to keep as little chemical residue out of the gloves as possible, but also keep the surface grime down, so you want to wash them pretty regularly. When you're trying to decide whether or not you want someone using gloves, generally, if it's loose photographs, the recommendation is yes. The emulsion layer is most at risk from finger oils, and you want to reduce the likelihood of someone sticking their fingers on photographs. So if they're just loose photographs and they're not sleeved, then generally you want to recommend that someone wear gloves. However, if the photographs are stored in an album, you want to really evaluate the stability of the album and the ability for someone to be able to turn those pages with dexterity. White gloves cut down your manual dexterity considerably. And so if you're having someone turn fragile pages of a photographic album or scrapbook, and you're making them wear gloves because you're concerned about the risk to the photographic emulsion, you also want to consider the risk to the page. Generally, I default, and this is personal choice, I default if it's an album that is not physically 100% stable, I would rather have them go out and wash their hands and use freshly washed, ungloved hands to handle an album or a scrapbook rather than the white gloves. But that is my choice, and that's a choice that you would want to make. And Bonnie, I don't like using any of the plastics with photographs. I prefer white cotton or clean hands are my two choices. The nitrile gloves, they're sticky, they're clingy, they pick up dirt really easily. I don't like them. They're chemically stable, which is better than like the latex and whatnot, which are chemically unstable and can actually leave a chemical residue on the photographs. But I prefer clean hands. I think it's just safer. Also, one thing you want to consider, obviously, is if you want the risks, the emulsion is only a factor when you're dealing with real photographs, obviously. If you're dealing with photo reproductions or prints, then obviously clean hands because it's the same as just a piece of paper. When you're exhibiting, you will have a whole bunch of different options. Generally, you're going to want to mat photographs before you exhibit them. There are a lot of different options for matting. That's a whole different workshop talking about matting and framing and all those different options. But basically, just some of the considerations you'll have to make is, do you want it over matted, which is what you see here, but this is not the best rendition of it, I apologize, which is basically the fact that the window mat sits on the object itself and overlaps the edge of the artifact just slightly. That is by far the most stable way because the mat actually holds the piece nice and flush and flat. However, aesthetically, sometimes that isn't what you want because it can reduce the amount of image that you can see. Float matting is when you pull the window of the mat away and you can see all the edges of the artifact, but that involves a much more complex way of attaching the artifact to the backing board. So that's something that you want to consider. Sink mats actually can be really handy if your photograph is slightly curled or has any sort of three-dimensionality to it, because a sink mat actually adds depth to the mat itself to allow for some depth of the object. So not all photographs are absolutely flat, and a sink mat would allow for a little bit of three-dimensionality there. And then wrap mats would be great for an object that perhaps goes on exhibit with some frequency, but also goes back into storage in its window mat and has a fragile surface, which a lot of photographs do, is you can actually basically just have a cover on your window mat, which is called the wrap. And so it basically forms almost a little box within the window mat. Attachment methods, by far the most common attachment method for photographs is going to be tissue hinges or linen hinges. What you want to know with both of those is that it is easily reversible and that the material is easily removable from the mat. Please, please, please do not heat set mount or even cold press mount a photograph to the backing board that is of historic importance. That is irreversible and you do not want to do that. It is not that important that the photograph remain absolutely positively flat because you are never going to get it off that backing board. Hinges are much more reversible. Basically, the less material that's being attached, even with reversible paste, to the object, the better. If you can, use corners, and that's what you see here in this image, is photo corners, either the type that you buy, but you can also make good preservation quality corners just by folding archival paper into little triangles and then gluing the triangle down to the board and sliding the photograph in, are completely non-adhesive. So generally, if you can do this, this is one of the best ways to go because the photograph will just easily pull out of the window mat. Slings are a much more complicated version of the corner where basically the support goes the whole way around all edges of the photograph. I couldn't find a good image of this online. I apologize. Hugh Phibbs at the American, not the Portrait Gallery, where is he? Help me, someone knows Hugh Phibbs. I'll look it up in a sec. But anyway, he has come up with some great ways to mount art using these tissue slings. But typically that's not something you're going to be able to do yourself. That would be something that you would be wanting to ask a professional matter and framer to do for you. Light levels, I'm not going to go into detail here since it's 11:56. We already talked about some of the different materials that are light sensitive, and I kind of hit on most of the major ones, but wanted to point to this document here, which is, I'm going to flip to very quickly. On the interweb, which is the Guidelines for Exhibition Light Levels for Photographic Materials. This is from the National Park Service. This is one of their conservograms, I believe, or at least it's from the National Park Service as part of that program. It might not be an actual conservogram. But this is a great resource that goes through general notes about light levels and gets you through how to measure what is high light level, what is low light level, and how to do those measurements, and then goes through what types of materials are extraordinarily light sensitive, very light sensitive, and gives lengths of exhibition for each of these. So you can see here that, let's try to find one that you actually know as opposed to Woodbury prints. So cyanotypes, we just talked about these. So this is saying that exhibition for those would be 3 months at 3-foot candles maximum, and that you should consider using a facsimile. So just useful there. And go back to my slides. Excellent. And then my last comment here, and then we have just a few minutes for questions if anybody has some. National Gallery of Art. Thank you, Dan. Dang it, I knew it was that. It just wasn't the Portrait Gallery. Anyway, Hugh's awesome. So if you look up the National Gallery of Art and look for Hugh Phibbs, just Google him. I know he has done some documentation on this, and I didn't think to pull good quality images for that in enough time to get them into this presentation, because I have physical examples that I usually show people, which would not translate very well to me holding them up to the webcam. But if you're interested in them, Hugh's the one who's really developed those slings. Anyway, last thing I wanted to talk about was conservation treatment. If you've got things that need any of these are most commonly done by conservators. Humidification and flattening is something that you can do yourself. A lot of you, it looks like, work at university settings in archives and special collections and are probably not unfamiliar with the concept of humidification and flattening. If you are comfortable with humidifying and flattening documents, you can humidify and flatten photographs as well. The one consideration you want to have with that is that the emulsion becomes much softer when it's humid, and you want to make sure that you're not impressing any texture onto a delicate humidified emulsion. And so you want to make sure that you're using something very, very smooth and soft against the emulsion while you're actually drying it under weight. And typically we recommend that you use Holotex for that, which is a lot like, it's a spun polyester, but it's a much finer, smoother material than Rime, which is what most people commonly use when they're using humidification and flattening packages. Conservators can also do this for you. Obviously, if it's really, really rolled tightly, you might want to consider just finding a conservator to do it for you. Mending tears, typically that's done on the back side and is reasonably straightforward. When you get to mending emulsions and trying to actually visually blend a cracked emulsion, that's a little bit more professionally necessary, and that's something that you really would need to talk to a photo conservator about. Appreciate I can give you the best insight I can. I can't say that I've talked. Josh Harris is our media preservation coordinator here at the university.
Give us a little insight into what materials he might be covering.
For preservation reformatting, and then I believe he'll also be talking very, very generally about some guides to reformatting. That's unfortunately a moving target. I don't see anybody typing, so I think I've lulled everybody into complacency and everybody's ready to go to lunch. I think they're all typing in thank yous. There is a question. We have several photos in one sleeve. Is that bad? No, generally. The only downside would be that obviously you need to pull them in and out all the time. If you've got several in there, you're not going to be able to see them. But if they're paper sleeves anyway, you'd have to do that anyway. So no, generally it is not bad at all. Just fine. Negatives in one sleeve are also fine. The only time where I would say that's bad, negatives, if they're all polyester, like modern-ish negatives, multiples in one sleeve is fine. If you have cellulose diacetate or nitrate-based negatives, so much older plastic-based negatives, then it really would be ideal to have them housed one negative per sleeve if possible.